Cleveland is a city that has a lot of potential in terms of urban agriculture. The one thing that is in abundance is space. Like most other Rust Belt cities, Cleveland is shrinking and has been for a very long time. Since its population peak in the 1950s, the population of Cleveland has been on a steady decline. This means that there is now an abundance of unused space throughout the city. In 2013, 7% of the land in Cleveland was vacant lots. Vacant land has been an issue for some time in Cleveland, but it worsened during the Great Recession, and entire neighborhoods, such as the Slavic Village, lay empty, most buildings and lots taken by the city and placed into the land bank. Cleveland also has a strong tradition of urban agriculture that stems from the influx of the Black population during the Great Migration. Black Americans brought their knowledge of food with them and introduced agricultural traditions to their new urban neighborhoods. My grandmother grew up not in urban Cleveland, but a more rural outer ring suburb. She still is able to recount some of the agrarian traditions that were ingrained in her upbringing. My grandmother is recovering from COVID, so I was unable to film her in person, but she sent in a very grandmother-esque video of herself highlighting some of these traditions.
I grew up in Wycliffe, Ohio in the 1950s to 60s. At that time, it was a rural community, and there were some people that gardened, but not a lot of us did that. Our next door neighbor did a lot of gardening, and I helped him pick his vegetables, which he shared with us. We had a lot of fruit trees in our yard, cherries, apples, pears, and grapevines. In the backyard, there were blackberry bushes. And one of our fun things to do was go pick pails of blackberries. And my mom would make blackberry pies or ice cream topped with blackberries. Some of our neighbors had chickens and goats. Food was fresher then and healthier without all of the pesticides. It was fun to just walk past a tree and pick something to eat while we were outside playing. My father was raised during the Depression, so my grandmother did a lot of canning. She would can things like tomatoes and peaches. She would cook the food down and then put it in jars, and then she would melt down the wax and put that on top, then put the lids on them and let them sit for a few months, actually, and she would give them away for Christmas presents. And she used to make fruitcakes, too, that were really good. My grandparents came to Cleveland from down south, where gardening was more prevalent. People stopped gardening because there were more grocery stores, and it was just easier and more convenient to go to the store and shop and bring the food home. It's good to know that now people are gardening more, and that gardening is coming back.
So, with all of this vacant land and remnants of an urban tradition of the past, Cleveland was primed for an agricultural revolution. This sparked a movement in the early 2000s to make Cleveland a greener city. This included various programs pouring money into urban agriculture efforts. One of the most seminal programs at the time stemmed from a document titled Reimagining a More Sustainable Cleveland. This document was created in conjunction of Kent State University and something called Cleveland Neighborhood Progress. I was unable to obtain a copy of this document despite my best efforts, but it is referenced in almost every scholarly article about shrinking cities and urban agriculture in the Rust Belt, and it was brought up by all three of the men that I interviewed. One of the men I interviewed is named Mansfield Frazier, and he was a recipient of some of the Reimagining Cleveland grant money. He is one of very few, if not the only grant recipient, who is still running their project. Mansfield runs a winery in the Huff neighborhood of Cleveland, which is an inner city neighborhood, and it employs recently incarcerated persons and attempts to get them back into the workforce and give them skilled labor to put on their resumes. Mansfield claims that his winery is self-sufficient, but in some of my research, I've come to the conclusion that this probably is not true. The winery is very robust, and it does have a biocellar that he created. It's a really successful project in many ways. Mansfield claims also that there is no way to sustain urban agriculture by growing food, only grapes or hops. He says that it's too hard to compete with industrial agriculture, and keeping volunteers productive is a Herculean task. He also, has a lot of his own ideas about, you know, how much something that is grant based works, and taking handouts, if you will. While I do not agree with Mansfield that urban agriculture is a completely lost cause and that there is no use in the kind of garden crop area of urban ag, I do very much so understand his frustrations with the system that he has seen fail time and time again, and that he has worked really hard to be successful in. Mansfield directed me toward a friend of his who had run a farm in the St. Clair Superior neighborhood of Cleveland named Carl Scalick. Carl was a recipient of a different grant and actually started the first urban farm in Cleveland in the 21st century. I was able to meet with Carl and talk with him a bit about his farm and his thoughts on urban agriculture in Cleveland. Carl's farm is no longer running, but he's still growing, which is really interesting. And his farm was actually very successful. It got a lot of press coverage. He was in the Plain Dealer. He got a lot of grant money. There was a CSA. He ran workshops, but eventually the farm closed about 8 years after it started.
But that's how I got started. Market garden training program, January through March of 2006. Found a piece of property, talked to the landowner, gave me permission, a written letter of permission, to turn his 1 acre of grass into the first farm started in Cleveland in the 20th century.
That's insane. That's a cool title to have.
It was insane. I was the first person foolish enough to try it this century. Others have followed in my footsteps. I'm not aware of any that have been successful, to tell you the truth, as a for-profit business.
Yeah.
The stick-to-itiveness thing. There's a few not-for-profits still floating around, but all they do is suck up grant money and tax dollars, and eventually they will run out of other people's money, and they probably too will dry up and blow away.
A huge obstacle for urban farmers and urban agricultural projects in Cleveland is the lack of long-term land. Even though Cleveland has a lot of vacant land and the land bank basically exists to give land to people, it's extremely difficult to get a lease longer than a year. You can really only go up to 5 years, I've heard colloquially, and it's basically impossible to buy land from the land bank. And so it's really hard to start a robust program that you can keep running for a long time, because a lot of people think that the city of Cleveland is still really focused on developing and expanding, when in reality the city is shrinking, and they have a hard time understanding that and coming to terms with that. And so, for instance, Dan Brown, who has been a part of the Cleveland food systems community for a very long time and runs Rust Belt Riders, which is a company that aims to make composting more accessible and to divert food waste in Cleveland. He kind of describes it as the city will give people land because they won't have to cut the grass on it anymore, but as soon as a new development opportunity comes along, the farm's done, it's time to build a building. For instance, Cleveland really pushed for the Amazon Center here, and it was something that a lot of people really disagreed with because it didn't seem like a good use of resources. If you kind of live in this scenario where as soon as there's a development opportunity, the garden is done, you're not really able to set roots, and you're not really able to make a lot of meaningful work. And that was really the demise of Carl's farm.
Well, my main obstacle was that the property owner decided he wanted to raise the rent from $900 a year for the land that I was using and some space in his manufacturing building that I was renting. He wanted to go from $900 a year to $900 a month. I took that as a please leave message, thinly veiled. And so I did.
Mm-hmm.
Closed it down, and so now I'm still growing, but different things in a different place.
Another big issue that urban farmers in Cleveland face is, simply that there's just not a lot of interest here. Food deserts are really highly prevalent in Cleveland, but the two urban farmers I actually talked to do not think that food deserts are real in a sense. They think it has a lot more to do. Mansfield Fraser feels like it has a lot more to do with a lack of transportation, a lack of a public transportation infrastructure. And Carl Scalick has a really interesting view on food deserts. He really thinks that, there's a lack of interest. There's a real struggle to attract customers, especially in the urban neighborhoods in which they are growing.
The amazing thing is, despite my limitations as a farmer, limitations of the soil, and I mentioned my limitations as a farmer, I was able to grow more stuff than I could sell.
Mm-hmm.
Who'd have thunk it?
Yeah.
I'm in the middle of this so-called food desert. People allegedly are clamoring for fresh, local food, something that hasn't traveled 1,500 miles. I mentioned fresh, and you would be wrong about all of that. By and large, nobody in my neighborhood cared.
Yeah.
My customers were from Shaker Heights, your hometown, or University Heights, or Cleveland Heights, or Beechwood. A few of them from the near west side over the years. My farm was in the St. Clair Superior neighborhood in Cleveland's east side, near east side. The St. Clair Superior Development Corporation's website touted its location and was proud to claim that there were 10,000 residents in the St. Clair Superior neighborhood and another 10,000 people who came in on a daily basis to work in the businesses that operated in the St. Clair Superior neighborhood. Now, granted, I was an English literature major, and higher math had always been a stumbling block, but I've generally been able to do arithmetic in my head. And if I had 10,000 residents and 10,000 employees together, I come up with a number that I think is 20,000. On Thursdays, we had a farmer's market. We would have, on a good Thursday, 30 or 40 people that would wander into the market for one reason or another. And when they did, I always asked them their zip codes. And when they told me their zip codes, they never, with one or two rare exceptions over several years, mentioned that they were from zip code 44103. Which is the zip code for the St. Clair Superior neighborhood.
And when I kind of pushed back on that and asked him if it had to do with, lack of education, lack of resources, he kind of chalked it up to lack of interest, and he thinks that food deserts are more about just proximity and that there's an innate lack of knowledge there and a lack of relationship with food and a lack of interest. And he doesn't think that has to do, that has to do distinctly with people of a lower socioeconomic status. The Bratenall neighborhood of Cleveland is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods, and it is also a food desert, but no one's really concerned about it as much, and it kind of makes you wonder why. Carl claims that produce is only 10% of the gross sales of most grocery stores, and he actually went to Dave's, which is a local chain of grocery stores here, and he found their data guy, and he asked him to pull data about SNAP recipients and about non-SNAP recipients. And the data kind of shows that they're both buying the same things roughly, and that maybe people just don't have as much of an interest in fresh produce anymore. And, I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with this idea that people just aren't interested in fresh produce. I, through this class, have learned that it has a lot more to do with knowledge and time and capital, and it's a very complicated problem that I don't think can be solved by any one thing. But it was really interesting to hear him talk about it because he just wasn't selling any vegetables, not even to the people who lived across the street from the farm. And I don't think it was because he wasn't trying. And so I think that there's something more to be thought of there and more to be explored in, why people aren't accessing these fresh foods. Or do they have access to farmers markets? Do they know about this program? Do they know where the farmers market is or how to use their card, or all of these things? And so it's something that I would like to explore further as I spend more time here. But as you can see from listening to Carl and listening to my recount of my conversation with Mansfield, there are people who really want urban agriculture to work here, and I think that it has a lot of potential to, but I think there's just an innate lack of support from the city in terms of land use, and in a lack of support and sustainability. I don't think there's really any teeth behind it, which is really disappointing. But I do think that there is a lot of potential in Cleveland for urban agriculture, and I really hope that in the future, people will really be able to rally support around it and get it going and be able to really sustain it for long periods of time. And so what I mean by this is, obviously in the early 2000s, there was a lot of support, there was a lot of buzz, there was a lot of money, millions and millions of dollars poured into urban agriculture in Cleveland, and there's not really very much to show for it at this point. Mansfield Fraser describes the hoop house graveyards that are dotted all around urban Cleveland, that someone threw up a hoop house and kind of left. There's when he thinks back to looking around in that Reimagining a More Sustainable Cleveland grant meeting, he says that almost every guy in that meeting is no longer running his farm. I mean, Carl, a very successful farmer, is no longer running his farm. Carl's recounted stories to me of friends who started farms and just weren't making any money and they had to stop. And even like the most successful urban farm in Cleveland there's a toss-up probably between the Ohio City farm and Riddle Farm. Riddle Farm is not making any money. It's extremely grant-based, and it has a lot of issues that I highlighted in my blog. And the Ohio City farm is highly, highly subsidized, and it is in a very affluent white neighborhood, and that's who's really working on that farm. I don't think that the momentum started in the early 2000s in terms of urban agriculture in Cleveland is gone. I just think it needs a kickstart again, and I think it needs just a little bit more support from the city and a little bit less of an emphasis on one guy trying to make a fortune or one farmer trying to turn his life around and make a lot of money. I think these farmers just need more support. They just need more money, and they need more volunteers, and they need more serious work to be put into their projects, not just by them, but by community and by the local government and by, farmers markets lowering their stall prices, and education in the communities about what it means to eat healthy and what it means to eat fresh produce. And I think there's a lot of potential there, and I think that it's not something that we should abandon as a city. I think that we really need to dig back in. I think we need to work harder, and I think we need to look back on these last 20 years of this development and movement and say, where did we go wrong and where can we continue to grow? Because Cleveland has a really strong tradition of urban agriculture, and I think we can build upon that and continue to grow that. We just need a little bit more time. And due to COVID and a lot of the things going on in the world, I wasn't able to really fully research this project and really dive deep into it as I want. And so I hope that in the future I can revisit this and kind of pick back up on it and really get a more clear picture and a more detailed profile, because I think it really deserves it. And I think that, I think there's just something here that needs a little bit more time. So thanks for watching.